On the morning of March 14th, 1839, in Caroline County, Virginia, an enslaved woman named Hannah gave birth to twin-born daughters behind the Marlowe plantation house. One infant had pale skin and light hair, the other dark skin and tight curls. Under Virginia law, both children were property of Thomas Marlowe, inheriting their mother's enslaved status regardless of their father's race or identity. The birth violated no written statute, but it exposed what plantation society demanded remain hidden: the routine sexual exploitation of enslaved women by white men, and the legal fiction that race could be neatly divided when the evidence of mixing lay crying in a midwife's arms. Within 6 months, one child would disappear from plantation records entirely. Hannah would be sold to a trader bound for New Orleans, and 3 white men would give sworn but contradictory testimony about events that night. How does a system built on racial hierarchy survive when the children into it make that hierarchy impossible to maintain? Subscribe to the Bondage Chronicles for stories that reveal the documentary record of American slavery. Now let's return to where it began. Hannah carried the water bucket across the yard at dawn, at the pace she had learned would draw no attention. The bucket was wood, bound with iron, and held roughly 3 gallons when filled to the marks scratched inside the rim. She made this walk 6 times each morning before the kitchen work began, filling the cistern outside the house, where Dinah would water for breakfast preparations. The route past the overseer's cabin, where Samuel Pierce usually stood on the porch drinking coffee and watching the quarters come to life. This morning he was there as always, but he watched her with a different kind of attention, his allowing her belly, which had grown large enough now that she had to adjust how she carried the bucket to keep her balance. Pierce called out to her when she was halfway across the yard. She stopped immediately, setting the bucket down and waiting with her hands at her sides. He did not come down from the porch. He asked her when the baby was due, and she told him what the midwife Celia had said. Another 3 weeks, maybe 4. He nodded slowly, then told her that starting tomorrow she would work in the house instead of the kitchen, that Mrs. Marlowe wanted her closer, that there were things that needed doing inside. Hannah said yes, sir. Pierce watched her pick up the bucket again. He told her to be careful with her back. She said yes, sir again, and continued walking. When she reached the cistern, Dinah was already there, and Dinah looked at her face but said nothing, which told Hannah that Dinah had heard the exchange and understood what Hannah understood: that Mrs. Marlowe had not questioned this change. Pierce was moving Hannah into the house for reasons that had nothing to do with household labor, and that whatever those reasons were, Hannah had no power to refuse them. The house assignment meant Hannah would see Thomas Marlowe more frequently. She had worked in the fields until 2 years ago, when Mrs. Marlowe had additional help after their previous house had been sold. Marlowe was a compact man with graying hair and careful movements who spoke rarely and gave instructions wife or through Pierce. He had never touched Hannah, never called her to his study, never done things she had learned to fear from other enslaved women's warnings. But 3 months ago, he had appeared at the kitchen house after dark, when Hannah was alone finishing the washing. He had not explained himself. He had locked the door. What happened afterward happened in silence, and when it was finished, he left without speaking. It occurred twice more over the following weeks, always at night, always wordless. When Hannah realized she was pregnant, she told no one, because there was nothing to tell that would change anything, and because Celia had warned her that sometimes speaking made things worse. The morning continued in its established pattern. Hannah filled the cistern, helped Dinah prepare breakfast for the Marlowe family and the overseer, carried dishes to the dining room, cleared them when the meal finished, washed them in the kitchen. At midday, Pierce appeared again and told her to go to the house, that Mrs. Marlowe was waiting. Hannah found Mrs. Marlowe in the parlor, sorting through linens in a wooden chest. Mrs. Marlowe was a thin woman in her 40s, whose face held a permanent expression of mild displeasure. She told Hannah to fold the linens by size and type, to place them back in the chest in proper order, and to do the same with the linens in the upstairs hall closet. She did not mention Hannah's pregnancy. She did not mention the change in assignment. She gave her instructions and left the room. Hannah began folding. The house was quiet in the afternoon. Through the windows, she could hear men working in the distant tobacco fields, the sound of their voices carrying across the open land. The parlor held furniture that Hannah had cleaned many times. A settee with burgundy upholstery, 2 ladder-back chairs, a small writing desk, a floor clock that chimed the quarter hours. On the mantelpiece stood a daguerreotype in a brass frame, showing Mr. and Mrs. Marlowe on their wedding day, both of them younger, both looking directly at the camera with expressions that revealed nothing. Hannah folded the linens according to Mrs. Marlowe's specifications. When she finished with the parlor chest, she carried the basket of remaining linens upstairs to the hall closet, where she found that the closet already held perfectly ordered stacks, which meant task exist not because it needed doing, but because Mrs. Marlowe wanted occupied inside the house, visible, contained. Hannah understood this without needing it explained. She completed the work anyway. That evening, after the dinner service, Pierce stopped her outside the kitchen and asked if she had family on any neighboring plantations. The question surprised her because Pierce knew her history as well as she did, knew she had been born on Marlowe land and had never been hired out or traveled beyond the plantation boundaries. She told him no, sir. He asked if she had received letters from anyone. She told him she could not read. He nodded, but his expression suggested these questions served a purpose she did not yet understand. He told her to report directly to the house in the morning, that Mrs. Marlowe would have more work for her. Then he walked away toward his cabin, and Hannah stood in the yard holding the empty basket, trying to determine what had changed and what it meant for what was coming. The housework continued for 8 days. Hannah cleaned rooms that required no cleaning, organized spaces already organized, and spent long hours sitting in the upstairs hallway mending linens that showed no damage. Mrs. Marlowe's instructions grew more specific and arbitrary. The napkins with the seams inward polished the brass handles on the parlor cabinet, rearranged the preserves in the cellar by date and type. The work kept Hannah inside, visible through windows, always within calling distance. Other enslaved people noticed. Dinah asked no questions but passed Hannah extra food when she could. Celia, the midwife, examined Hannah during this period and said the baby was positioned well, that the birth would come soon, that Hannah should rest more than she was resting. On the 9th day, Mrs. Marlowe called Hannah into the parlor and told her to sit down. This was unprecedented. Enslaved people did not sit with white people unless ordered to do so for a specific task. Hannah sat on the edge of the ladder-back chair. Mrs. Marlowe remained standing by the window, looking out at the yard. She asked Hannah if the baby was Thomas Marlowe's child. Hannah understood that the question was not really a question but a demand for acknowledgement of something Mrs. Marlowe already believed. She said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Marlowe continued looking out the window. She said that when the child was born, arrangements would be made. She said Hannah would continue working in the house until then. She said Hannah should not discuss the situation with anyone. Then she dismissed Hannah without looking at her. That night, Hannah woke to cramping pain in her lower back. Celia had told her to recognize this as early labor, that it could last hours or days before the real work began. Hannah did not wake anyone. She lay still in her cabin, listening to the breathing of the other women who shared the space, waiting for the pain to intensify or fade. By morning, the cramping had subsided but disappeared. She went to the house as instructed. Mrs. Marlowe was not there. Pierce was waiting in the kitchen. He told Hannah that Mr. Marlowe wanted to see her in his study. The study was a small room on the first floor where Marlowe kept ledgers and paperwork related to plantation business. Hannah had cleaned it dozens of times, but had never been summoned there. Marlowe sat behind a desk covered with documents. He did not invite her to sit. He told her that when the child was born, if it appeared white, certain steps would need to be taken to protect the family's reputation. He said these steps might include removing the child from the plantation. He said this was for everyone's benefit. He spoke in the same neutral tone he used when discussing crop yields or equipment repairs. Hannah said yes, sir, because there was nothing else to say, and refusing to acknowledge his words would change nothing about what he intended to do. The labor began in earnest 2 nights later, just after midnight. The cramping transformed into waves of pain that made Hannah cry out despite her intention to remain quiet. The other women woke immediately. Someone went to fetch Celia. Within 20 minutes, Celia arrived with her bag of supplies and began preparing the cabin for delivery. She examined Hannah and said the birth would happen soon, that the baby was positioned correctly, that Hannah needed to focus on breathing and pushing when the time came. The other women boiled water, tore cloth for rags, moved furniture to create more space. This was routine for them. They had witnessed and participated in many times. What made this birth different was not the labor itself, but what everyone knew waited on the other side of it. The first baby was born at 3 in the morning. Celia caught him, cleared his airways, handed him to one of the women to clean. Before anyone could examine him closely, Hannah cried out again, and Celia understood immediately what the others took longer to recognize. There was a second baby. Twins were not rare, but they were always dangerous, always carried higher risk of death for mother or children or both. Celia worked quickly, checking Hannah's condition, preparing for the second delivery. The second baby was born 20 minutes later. Celia caught him, cleared his airways, laid him on the cloth beside his brother. The cabin became very quiet. The 2 infants were crying strong, healthy cries that indicated good lung development, but they looked nothing alike. The baby had pale skin, undertones, fine light brown hair. The second baby had darker skin, the rich brown that would identify him immediately and permanently as Negro. Both were clearly healthy. Both were clearly Thomas Marlowe's sons. The genetic lottery of mixed-race birth had produced the one outcome that made the situation impossible to hide or explain away. Visual proof of what had happened in duplicate, with opposite results. Celia cleaned both babies, wrapped them separately, handed them to Hannah. The other women stood motionless, understanding what this meant but not yet speaking it aloud. Hannah held both infants, one in each arm, and looked at their faces. They had the same small nose, the same shape of chin. The only difference was color. That difference was everything. Under Virginia law, both babies were enslaved, because slavery passed through the mother's line. But only one baby looked enslaved. The other baby looked like Thomas Marlowe's legitimate white son, except he was not legitimate, could never be legitimate, and his existence created a legal and social crisis that would require immediate resolution. Celia told one of the women to fetch Pierce. The woman hesitated, then left the cabin. The others waited. Hannah nursed both babies, moving them from breast to breast, learning the rhythm of feeding twins. No one spoke. They all understood that what happened next would not be determined by Hannah's wishes or the baby's needs, but by what Thomas Marlowe decided would protect his reputation and legal standing. The plantation system had rules for situations like this, unwritten rules that everyone understood. Mixed-race children were common. But twins of visibly different races, born the same night to an enslaved woman who had been used by her owner, created a documentary problem. Records would need to be adjusted. Explanations would need to be invented. One or both children would likely need to disappear. Pierce arrived 20 minutes later. He looked at the babies. His face showed no expression. He asked Celia if both children were healthy. Celia said yes. He asked if Hannah was healthy. Celia said yes. He told everyone to stay in the cabin, that Mr. Marlowe would give instructions in the morning. Then he left. The women remained awake for the rest of the night, holding the babies while Hannah slept. No one discussed what they expected to happen. There was no point. They had all seen children disappear before. They had all learned that mourning in advance changed nothing. At dawn, Pierce returned with a document. He did not enter the cabin. He stood in the doorway and told Celia that Mr. Marlowe had recorded the birth of one male child to Hannah, born March 14th. The record showed one child only. Pierce's tone was completely neutral, as if he were reading routine information from a ledger. He told Celia to prepare both babies for travel, that arrangements had been made. Then he walked back toward the main house without answering any questions or acknowledging the implications of what he had said. The document remained in his hand. No copy was left with Celia or Hannah. The official record now stated that Hannah had given birth to one child, which meant the second child legally did not exist. What Pierce had not specified, and what became clear only in the silence after he left, was which baby the record described and which baby had been erased. The next hours unfolded with procedural efficiency. Mrs. Marlowe appeared at the cabin mid-morning with another woman Hannah did not recognize, a white woman dressed well but not elaborately, who carried a leather bag. Mrs. Marlowe pointed to the pale baby and told the woman to examine him. The woman checked his eyes, his mouth, his reflexes, handling him with the practiced efficiency of someone who evaluated infants regularly. She told Mrs. Marlowe the child appeared healthy and well-formed. Mrs. Marlowe nodded. She told Hannah to continue nursing both babies until evening, that further instructions would come then. The two white women left together, speaking in low voices that did not carry back to the cabin. Hannah fed the babies throughout the day. Other enslaved women brought her food and water but said little. The cabin held a peculiar tension, everyone aware that this might be Hannah's last day with one or both children, but no willing to name that possibility directly. Celia checked Hannah's physical recovery twice and found it normal. She did not mention the baby's futures. In the afternoon, Hannah finally asked Celia what she thought would happen. Celia was quiet for a long time before answering. She said that sometimes white families kept light-skinned children born to enslaved women, raising them as servants who lived in the house and performed specialized tasks. She said other times such children were sent away to distant relatives who did not know their origin. She said dark-skinned children always stayed enslaved. She said complicated everything because their matching features made the parentage undeniable. She said she did not know what Marlowe would decide, but that his decision would prioritize his reputation above everything else. At dusk, Pierce returned with a man Hannah had seen before but did not know by name. The man was white, middle-aged, drove a wagon that waited in the yard outside the quarters. Pierce told Hannah to bring the dark-skinned baby. Not both babies, just one. Hannah understood then which child the plantation record described and which child had been erased from it. Pale baby was recorded as her son, born March 14th, enslaved property of Thomas Marlowe. The dark baby, legally, had never been born. His absence from the record meant his removal from the plantation would leave no documentary trace, no gap in the inventory, no unexplained loss. Hannah held the dark baby and did not move. Pierce repeated the instruction. Celia touched Hannah's arm gently and whispered that resisting would make things worse, that they would take the child regardless, that Hannah's only choice was whether she would be beaten before they took him. Hannah stood up slowly and walked out carrying her son. The man with the wagon took the baby without speaking. He had clearly done this before, had clearly been paid to transport children whose existence created problems for white families. Pierce handed him a paper, which the man folded and put in his pocket. Hannah tried to ask where the baby was going. Pierce told her to go back inside. She asked again. Pierce's hand moved his belt where he kept a leather strap. Hannah went back inside. The wagon left immediately. No one in the quarters watched it go. Watching would have served no purpose except to document their helplessness. Inside the cabin, Hannah held the remaining baby, the pale one. The recorded one, the child whose skin color meant he might have a different future, but still no freedom. The days following the separation demonstrated how efficiently the plantation system could absorb and normalize what had happened. No one mentioned the missing baby. The birth record in Marlowe's ledger showed one male child born to Hannah. No additional details provided. The other enslaved people avoided discussing the situation directly, though Hannah noticed their careful kindness toward her. Extra help with tasks, food left outside her cabin door, quiet company when she was alone. These gestures acknowledged the loss without naming it, offering what comfort was possible within a system that made such losses routine. Hannah continued nursing the remaining baby, whom she named Samuel, though she knew the name would not appear in any record. Mrs. Marlowe instructed Hannah to return to house after 2 weeks, bringing the baby with her in a basket. This arrangement was unusual but not unprecedented. Light-skinned children born to enslaved women sometimes occupied ambiguous positions in plantation households, neither fully enslaved nor fully acknowledged, performing domestic work that kept them visible and controlled. Hannah understood that Mrs. Marlowe's decision to keep Samuel served multiple purposes. It prevented Hannah from work fields, where Samuel might be neighboring plantation owners or visitors. It allowed Mrs. Marlowe to monitor the child's development and appearance as he grew, and it established early that despite his pale skin, Samuel was enslaved property with no illusions about his status. Thomas Marlowe never acknowledged the birth. He never looked at Samuel. He never spoke to Hannah about what had happened. His silence was its own form of communication, establishing that from his perspective the situation was resolved and required no further discussion. This was consistent with how plantation owners typically handled children born from their sexual exploitation of enslaved women. The children were property, recorded in ledgers alongside livestock and equipment, their parentage irrelevant to their legal status. What made Samuel's case different was only his appearance, which created ongoing risk that someone might question his origins or suggest he deserved different treatment based on his skin color. That risk materialized 3 months after the birth. A distant cousin of Mrs. Marlowe's visited the plantation, a woman from Richmond who had never been to Caroline County before. She saw Hannah working in the house with Samuel in his basket nearby. She asked Mrs. Marlowe about the baby, commenting on how unusual it was to see such a light-colored child born to an enslaved woman. Mrs. Marlowe's response was immediate and sharp. She said the child's father was a white overseer from a neighboring plantation who had since moved away, that these situations sometimes occurred, that the child was enslaved regardless, and the matter was closed. The cousin accepted the explanation. Social convention required her to, but her questions had exposed the vulnerability that Samuel's presence created. That evening, Thomas Marlowe called Pierce to his study. Hannah was working in the adjacent parlor and could hear their conversation through the wall. Marlowe said the situation with the child was becoming problematic, that noticing that it would be better to resolve it permanently. Pierce asked what resolution Marlowe wanted. Marlowe said the child should be sold, but not locally, somewhere distant where no one would connect him to the family. Pierce said the child was still nursing and very young, that traders might not pay well for an infant who required that much care. Marlowe said to wait 6 more months until the child was weaned, then make the arrangement. Pierce said, "Sir." The conversation ended. Hannah continued folding linens in the parlor, her hands moving automatically while her mind worked through what she had heard. 6 months provided time but not hope. Selling enslaved children away from their mothers was routine practice, justified economically and legally as plantation owners' right to manage their property as they saw fit. The age at which children were sold varied, but weaning was a common transition point because it marked the end of the child's complete dependency on the mother. Once Samuel stopped nursing, he became a more valuable commodity, portable, transferable, and old enough to survive to distant markets. Hannah understood these calculations because every enslaved woman understood them. What made Samuel's pending sale particularly cruel, that it existed solely to protect Thomas' plantation, not to generate profit or serve any agricultural purpose. Samuel was being sold to eliminate evidence of his father's identity. Hannah made no obvious plans to prevent this. She could not run away, because enslaved people who were tracked with dogs and punished severely when caught, and because running with an infant made escape even less likely to succeed. She could not appeal to any legal authority, because enslaved people had no legal standing to challenge their owners' decisions. She could not ask other enslaved people for help, because involving them would only expand the circle of punishment when the escape attempt failed. Her only strategy was to make herself indispensable enough that Mrs. Marlowe might reconsider the sale, a strategy that had almost no chance of working, but was the only option available. She began working longer hours, volunteering for additional tasks, demonstrating exceptional competence at everything assigned to her. Mrs. Marlowe noticed the effort, but showed no sign that it affected her husband's decision. In the 5th month after the birth, a second crisis emerged. A white woman from the county courthouse appeared at the plantation asking questions about birth records. She was conducting a census update and had noticed inconsistencies in Marlowe's documentation of enslaved people born during the previous year. The record showed one birth in March, a male child to Hannah, but the woman had rumors from other plantations that there had been twins. She asked the current children in the quarters to verify the count. This was unusual but not illegal. Plantation owners were required to maintain accurate records for tax purposes, though enforcement was inconsistent and rarely challenged families' documented claims about their property. Pierce showed the woman around the quarters. He showed her Samuel, identifying him as the one male child born in March. The woman looked at Samuel's pale skin and said this was highly unusual. Pierce said the child was white, that such births occurred occasionally, that the child, regardless of appearance. The woman wrote notes in her ledger, but seemed unconvinced. She asked if she could speak with Hannah. Pierce said Hannah was working in the house. The woman walked to the house. Mrs. Marlowe intercepted her at the door and told her that Hannah was occupied and that all relevant information had been provided. The woman asked again about rumors of twins. Mrs. Marlowe said rumors were unreliable and that the official record was accurate. The woman left, but her skepticism was visible. That night, Thomas Marlowe called Pierce and Hannah to his study together, which had never happened before. He told Hannah that she had discussed the birth with people outside the plantation and that this was forbidden. Hannah said she had told no one anything. Marlowe said someone had talked, that the census woman knew too much, that Hannah was the only possible source. Hannah repeated that she had said things. Marlowe did not believe her. He told Pierce 20 lashes the next morning. Pierce said, "Yes, sir." Hannah was dismissed. She returned to her cabin understanding that she was being punished not for talking, but for existing in a situation that continued to generate questions. The whipping would serve as warning to everyone in the quarters that discussing the birth or the missing twin was forbidden. It was established to outside observers that Marlowe maintained firm control over his property and took rumors seriously. Whether Hannah had actually talked was irrelevant to these purposes. The whipping occurred in the yard behind the quarters, where such punishments always took place. Pierce administered it efficiently, without additional cruelty but without mercy. Hannah did not cry out. Crying out would have given Marlowe satisfaction and would have made the other enslaved people feel worse about their inability to help her. She took the 20 lashes in silence, then went to her cabin where Celia cleaned her back and applied ointment to prevent infection. The other women brought her food and water but said nothing. They all understood the message the punishment communicated. Silence mandatory. Questions were dangerous, and the system protected itself through violence when necessary. The sale occurred in September, 1 week before Samuel's 6-month milestone. Learned about it not from any direct announcement, but from seeing speak with a man in the yard, a man whose presence served only one purpose: buying and transporting enslaved people to distant markets. The man examined Samuel briefly, checking his teeth and reflexes the way he would examine any other merchandise. He offered Pierce a price. Pierce accepted. Money changed hands. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Hannah was working in the house when it happened. By the time she understood what was occurring, it was already finished. She came outside carrying Samuel. She directly to Pierce and asked where the baby was being taken. Pierce said that was not her concern. She asked again. Pierce told her to go back inside. She did not move. The trader took Samuel from her arms. Hannah tried to hold on. The trader was stronger. He pulled the baby away and walked toward his wagon, where 3 other small children were already waiting, all of them too young to understand what was happening but old enough to cry. Hannah followed him. Pierce grabbed her arm. She pulled away. Pierce grabbed again, harder this time, his fingers digging into her shoulder. Hannah kicked him in the shin. Pierce let go momentarily. Hannah ran toward the wagon. She got within 6 feet before 2 other white men appeared, men who worked for the trader, men whose job was prevent exactly this kind of disruption. They caught Hannah and held her while the trader secured Samuel in the wagon and drove away. Pierce dragged Hannah back to the quarters. He threw her into her cabin and locked the door from outside. She could hear Samuel crying in the wagon as it moved down the road. The sound faded slowly, taking minutes to disappear completely. She could hear other enslaved people outside her cabin, their voices low and urgent, discussing what to do. They could do nothing. The lock held. Pierce stood guard. By nightfall, the wagon was miles away and Samuel was gone forever. Pierce unlocked the cabin door and told Hannah that if she caused any more trouble, she would be sold too. She did not respond. He left. She sat in the dark cabin alone, her breast still full of milk, her body still calibrated to a 6-month-old's feeding schedule, her mind working through the mathematics of loss. The following days were administratively complex. Thomas Marlowe updated his plantation record to show the sale of 1 male child, property of Hannah, to a trader named Johnston working for a firm in New Orleans. The record did not mention Samuel's appearance or parentage. It listed only the date of sale and the price received. This resolved the documentary problem Samuel had created. He was no longer on the plantation, no longer generating questions, no longer evidence of anything. The other twin remained unrecorded, legally non-existent, his disappearance leaving no administrative trace because he had never officially existed. Both twins were now gone, but only one had ever been counted. Hannah stopped working in the house. Mrs. Marlowe reassigned her to field labor, which was punishment, but in Hannah's case might have been mercy, removing her from daily proximity to the family that had taken her children. The field work was harder physically but simpler emotionally. She planted tobacco, weeded rows, harvested leaves, performed the repetitive tasks that required no thought and permitted no questions. The other field workers left her alone, understanding that nothing they said would help, and that speaking about the situation might draw Pierce's attention or Marlowe's punishment. Hannah worked in silence. She ate in silence. She existed in the mechanical routine that enslaved people developed to survive trauma they could not escape or change. In October, a month after Samuel's sale, this woman returned. She asked to see the updated records. Pierce showed her Marlowe's ledger with the sale documented. She noticed that the birth record still showed only one child born in March, but that other plantation documents from neighboring properties showed rumors of twins. She asked Pierce directly if twins had been born. Pierce said the record was accurate, that rumors were false, that enslaved people sometimes invented stories. The woman looked unconvinced, but legally had no authority to challenge a plantation owner's documentation of his own property. She noted the discrepancy in her report, but took no further action. The law protected Marlowe's right to record his property as he chose. What the census woman did not know, and what Pierce did not tell her, was that Marlowe had already begun taking steps to eliminate the possibility of future questions. 2 weeks after Samuel's sale, Marlowe contacted a slave trader in Richmond and arranged for Hannah's sale. The price was low because Hannah was difficult, because she had attacked Pierce, because her presence reminded everyone of what had happened. The trader agreed to take her. The sale was scheduled for November. Hannah learned about this from Celia, who had overheard Pierce discussing it with another overseer. Celia told Hannah she perhaps 3 weeks before the trader came. Hannah asked where she would be sent. Celia said probably south, probably New Orleans or Mobile, places where northern traders sold enslaved people they had purchased in Virginia. The journey would take weeks. The conditions would be brutal. Many people died during the transport. Hannah asked if there was any way to prevent the sale. Celia said no. Once a sale was arranged, it proceeded unless the buyer changed his mind, which rarely happened. Hannah's only choice was whether to accept it passively or resist and be beaten before being sold anyway. That night, Hannah made the decision that would define how people remembered her story afterward. She decided to run. She knew the attempt would almost certainly fail. She knew that captured runaways were punished severely, sometimes killed. She knew that running, not bring her children back, change what had already happened. But staying meant accepting the sale, accepting transport to New Orleans, accepting a future where she would never know what happened to either of her sons, would never know if the dark-skinned had survived his first year, would never know if Samuel remembered her voice. Running meant choosing action over submission, even if the action led to death. It meant claiming some agency within a system to eliminate agency completely. It meant refusing to cooperate with her own erasure. She ran on November 1st, 3 days before the trader was scheduled to arrive. She left at night, taking only a knife from the kitchen house and a wool blanket. She headed north toward the Rappahannock River, planning to follow it east toward the bay, where she had heard that free black communities existed and that some people helped runaways reach Pennsylvania. She knew the route was dangerous, that the river area was heavily patrolled, that traveling at night without papers or protection made her vulnerable to every white person who saw her. She ran anyway. Pierce discovered her absence at dawn. He organized a search party immediately, taking 3 white men and 4 dogs specially trained to track runaways. The dogs picked up Hannah's scent within an hour. The men followed. By midday, they had closed the distance significantly. Hannah heard the dogs before she saw them. She tried to run faster, but she was exhausted, malnourished, and still physically weakened from childbirth 6 months earlier. It reached her within minutes. The men were close behind. Pierce her to stop. She kept running. Pierce fired his pistol into the air. Hannah fell, not from being shot but from tripping over a route she had not seen. The dogs circled her, barking but not attacking. Pierce walked over slowly, looking down at her without expression. He asked why she ran. Hannah did not answer. He asked again. She said she would not go to New Orleans. He told her that was not her decision to make. She said she knew that. He told her to get up. She stayed on the ground. Pierce nodded to one of the other men, who grabbed Hannah's arm and pulled her to her feet. They tied her hands behind back with rope. They led her back to the plantation. The walk took 4 hours. By the time they arrived, it was evening. Pierce locked Hannah in a storage shed near the quarters and told her she would be dealt with in the morning. He left 2 men standing guard to ensure she did not another escape. Thomas Marlowe stood in the yard the next morning and addressed the assembled enslaved people. He told them that Hannah had attempted to run away, that she had been caught, and that her punishment would serve as warning to anyone else considering similar action. He said running was theft because enslaved people were property, and taking property that did not belong to you was a crime. He said Hannah's punishment be 50 lashes, administered publicly, followed by immediate sale at whatever price the trader would accept given her now damaged condition. He said this was mercy, because he could have chosen to have her hanged, which was legal punishment for runaways under Virginia law. No one in the audience responded. Response was not requested or permitted. Pierce administered the 50 lashes with the procedural efficiency he had used for the previous punishment. The whipping took 20 minutes. Hannah lost consciousness twice during the process. Both times they revived her with cold water and continued. When it was finished, Celia and another woman carried Hannah to the cabin where they cleaned her wounds and tried to stabilize her condition. Her back was destroyed, the skin torn open in multiple places, infection already beginning despite Celia's immediate treatment. Celia believed Hannah would survive, was not certain. Survival depended on whether the wounds became seriously infected and whether Hannah's body, already depleted from childbirth and the stress of the previous months, could fight off the trauma. The trader arrived 2 days later. He examined Hannah, saw her condition, and reduced his offer by half. Marlowe accepted. The trader loaded Hannah into his wagon along with other enslaved people he had purchased from neighboring plantations. Hannah was conscious but barely responsive. The wagon departed. The other enslaved people in Marlowe's quarters watched it leave. No one spoke. They returned to their assigned tasks. The plantation continued operating according to its established rhythms. Within a week, new people were working the tasks Hannah had previously performed. Within a month, most references to her had stopped. The system had processed the disruption and restored order. The plantation record showed Hannah's sale in November 1839 to a Richmond trader for transportation to New Orleans markets. It showed the birth of one male child to Hannah in March 1839, subsequently sold in September 1839 to a different trader. It showed no other children, no second infant who had disappeared with documentation. The record was clean, consistent, and legally sufficient. Anyone examining it afterward would see only routine transactions. An enslaved woman who gave birth, whose child was sold, who attempted to run and was sold as consequence. The story told by the record was incomplete but functional. It protected Marlowe's reputation and legal standing. It created no problems for his family or his business relationships. The broader community accepted this version of events because acceptance was easier than investigation, and because challenging a white man's documentation of his property served no one's interests except possibly the enslaved people themselves, whose interests were legally irrelevant. Neighboring plantation owners heard rumors about twins but saw no evidence in official records and had no incentive to pursue the matter further. The census woman noted discrepancies in her report, but took no action beyond notation. The system preferred documented certainty over uncomfortable questions, especially when those questions implied criticism of men who held social and economic power. A third occurred in subsequent years that connected tangentially to Hannah's story, but were never officially linked to it. In 1841, a light-skinned boy approximately 2 years old was found living in a Richmond orphanage under circumstances that were never clearly explained. The orphan record showed him arriving in 1839 with no documentation of his parents or origin. He was eventually apprenticed to a printer and disappeared into the free black population of Virginia's cities. In 1843, a slave trader in Mobile was tried for the suspicious death of a female slave during transport from Virginia, but the case was dismissed due to insufficient evidence and the difficulty of prosecuting crimes against enslaved people. In 1845, Thomas Marlowe died of pneumonia, leaving the plantation to his wife, who sold it 2 years later and moved to Richmond. None of these events were recorded as related to each other. They existed as separate data points in the administrative record of slavery's operations. The Caroline County birth records for 1839 remain preserved in the Virginia State Archives, accessible to researchers who request them. Entry for March 14th shows one male birth to an enslaved woman named Hannah, property of Thomas Marlowe. No correction or annotation appears in the margin. No secondary documentation contradicts the single birth claim. The record stands as written, technically accurate in what it states and entirely false in what it omits. A permanent testament to how systems maintain themselves by controlling which facts survive and which disappear into a administrative silence that looks exactly like truth.